In most fantasy, a knight just exists. They show up on screen with shiny armor, the perfect seat in the saddle, and combat reflexes of a god, as if they were born in a plate mail onesie. But in the real Middle Ages, a knight was a fighting organism that took 21 years to grow. It was a process that started at age 7 with a wooden stick and ended at 21 with a ritual bath and a blessed blade. Today, we're diving into the training and gear of the medieval knight. We're looking at the grueling reality of the squire's grind, the high-tech cockpits we call saddles, and the brutal physics of the couched lance. But we're also looking at how fantasy staples like mithril, Valyrian steel, and combat magic impact the historical logic of the battlefield. Welcome to episode 2 of the series on knights by Just-in-Time Worldbuilding with your host, Marie Mullaney. Let's start by what it took to train a knight. Now listen, before we hit the rest of the section, let me just address one elephant in the room. Yes, it was possible for a soldier or even a commoner to be declared a knight by showing enormous courage and valor, and we'll talk about one of those examples later. Sure, it was possible, but it was super rare. And it's a little bit of propaganda. Like, sure, of course social mobility is possible, cupcake. Just do the super impossible thing and you too can be a knight. It's a bit like the Chinese Confucian exams. Sure, anyone can pass them and become a bureaucrat. But the reality is that you need time, tutors, and books to study, so in practice, it's mostly just the elite kids who get to become bureaucrats. Same with the knights. There were other ways to become a knight, but mostly they were well beyond the reach of anyone who didn't absolutely overflow with main character energy. Okay, so with that out the way, let's talk training. Knightly training started with becoming a page. A boy was normally sent away from his home at the age of 6 or 7 to serve as a page in another noble's home. This was done for 2 reasons. 1, it ensured the kid wasn't being treated softly by his own family, and 2, it built relationships between nobles that they could draw on later in life in order to build alliances. Pages who served together often were even closer than family, as we see in Song of Ice and Fire with Robert and Ned. Pages did a lot of menial labor. They looked after the horses, mucked out the stable, sharpened swords, served the dinner, even cleaned rooms in the castle. They also learned history and sometimes reading and writing. But they didn't really learn the fighting crafts yet. That only started when they turned 12 or 13 and they became squires. Before that, it was mostly just sticks and play. Now, squires spent the bulk of their time in armor, and they learned all about looking after knightly gear and the fighting arts. And squires were eventually, at the age of 21 or so, promoted to knights. By this time, they had proven to excel at all the skills a knight needed, most specifically what some have labeled the 7 points of agility, or septem probitus. And what are those, you ask? I'm so glad you did. First, riding and horsemanship and the lance. This was the absolute foundation, and it was way more than sitting on a horse. You had to be able to mount and dismount at a gallop, to control a temperamental stallion with only your knees and light hands on the reins. You had to maintain a perfect seat even when being struck by an opponent. You also had to learn to use a lance. That meant training with the thing until you were fantastic, including tilting at rings and the quintain. Speaking of the quintain, you've seen it in every movie, right? The knight hits a wooden shield on a swivel and a heavy sandbag swings around to clobber the knight if it's too slow. This part, that's nonsense. The modern TV dude, Jason, he or the medieval TV dude Jason, he tried to make this happen. He's practically begged the sandbag to hit him, and it's almost physically impossible. If you hit that shield with enough force to spin the arm, you're already well past the point of impact by the time the bag swings around. The quintain wasn't this dodge or die reflex test. It was just a target designed to teach you how to hit a stationary object with a lance without shattering your own arm or falling on your horse. It's a training tool, not a slapstick comedy prop. The reason why it had a weight attached to it was to train the squire in taking an impact when they hit the shield, not to smack them if they missed it or some such nonsense. Anyway, our second part of the 7 skill set is swimming and diving. We often hear the story that knights were terrified of water because of their armor, but this is pretty exaggerated. Historical training did emphasize swimming. It was a vital survival skill for crossing rivers during a campaign. And more importantly, doing this while wearing a padded gambeson or a partial mail even built incredible core strength and lung capacity. I do doubt that they swam in full armor, however. I think that part would kill you. Your third one was shooting and archery. Now, a knight was primarily a melee fighter, do not get me wrong, but they were expected to be reasonably proficient with missile weapons, including maybe the crossbow or the hunting bow or some such. And they also had to know how to defend against these weapons, including darts and throwing spears and so on. Your fourth skill is climbing. Squires practiced climbing walls, ladders, and even ropes, again, often while wearing their armor. This was preparation for siege warfare. If you were the first man over the battlements, you needed the upper body strength to haul yourself up while people were throwing rocks and boiling oil at your head, and you needed to do it while wearing the 25 kilos worth of armor. 5 is fencing and swordsmanship. I mean, of course. This was an incredibly technical skill. It involved mastering the long sword, the arming sword, and the buckler. Knights didn't just hack at each other. They needed to understand leverage and timing, binding another person's blade, footwork, all of the elements of fencing. Fencing is basically a high-speed chess match played with steel. Our sixth skill is wrestling and grappling. In actual knightly combat, if you didn't kill your opponent in the first pass of the lance, you usually ended up rolling around on the ground. Wrestling was essential for finding the gaps in an opponent's plate armor and using your dagger, the misericordiae, to finish the fight. Most medieval fighting manuals, like Vechtbrugger and the like, spend as much time on wrestling as they do on swords. And our seventh skill was courtly arts, which is dancing and etiquette. This is a point people often overlook. A knight was a member of the social elite. Dancing was used to prove that the warrior had grace and poise and endurance. If you could dance a complex athletic set for an hour in a heated hall after a day of hunting, you had the wind and the footwork necessary for a long battle, as well as having the etiquette to conduct yourself with grace and poise in the king's court. If you look at these 7 points of agility, it becomes clear that the knight was not just a warrior. The knight was a professional athlete and an elite citizen of a polity. And learning all of these skills took one heck of a strain on these kids. We see the sheer physical toll of this kind of training perfectly captured in Tamora Pierce's Tortal books, specifically Alana, the First Adventure. Pierce nails the reality that you can't just be a knight. You have to rewire your entire musculoskeletal system. Alana is constantly exhausted, bruising her ribs and pushing through the pain just barely cope with a day's work as a page. And Pierce also adds the fantasy factor of magic. Alana isn't just training her body, she's also training her gift of magic, which is where fantasy world building gets very interesting. In the real world, the squire's education was purely physical and social. In a fantasy world, the elite must also navigate the potential for magic. How do knights cope with it? In my world, all my knights are also competent in magic. But you don't have to go this route. Knights could be equipped with magic items, which could be capable of turning magic aside. Or a knight could be assigned to a mage, and the mage deals with magic while the knight does the fighting. All of these offer very interesting storytelling opportunities. Back in Tortal, Alana learns the basics of magic, but only the very basics. When the king's brother, Roger, plots to claim the throne, he represents the danger of a knightly class that doesn't just have the monopoly on physical violence, but on metaphysical violence too. And Roger very nearly succeeds in his coup. So, if you're creating a knight equivalent class in your world, consider if magic replaces the need for physical stamina or training, or maybe it adds to it. Would a warrior be better suited to learn to throw fireballs or tilt at the quinte? Or is it a case of learning both, though neither with the skill of a true specialist? And what skills does your squire have to demonstrate in order to become a knight at all? Does that skill include magic? And for help in creating magic items that can support your knights in the field, let me briefly plug World Building Blueprints Volume 1, which you can buy in PDF or EPUB on my website right now. Possibly also the physical copies. The Kickstarter should be fulfilled by the time this video goes live. The book has a whole chapter about building out your magic system, including magic items of various types and even artifacts. And this isn't just theory. There are exercises, examples, worksheets, and some truly gorgeous art, even in the black and white paperback. And I'll throw in a discount if you use the code NIGHT2026, all caps. There is a 20% discount on all digital books on my website. Links to that down below. Now, let's get back to Night. A knight's life was filled with ritual, especially in the transitions from page to squire to knight, and most especially that last one. We'll unpack them and talk about what it was like in both history and how Tamora Pierce adapted those transition rituals in Tortal. By the way, I did a video a while ago about the importance of ritual, if you want to check that out in the information card. Okay, so we start with the page. This wasn't a formal ritual in the way that, say, knighthood was, but it's a very definitive cliff edge end to childhood. The page's life was defined by the transition from domestic care to an apprenticeship of service. They move away from home and they need to become way more grown up in their new role. The next step is transitioning from page to squire. In our world and our history, that meant the squire was now wearing armor and perhaps serving a specific knight. The squire might also actually participate in fighting and would focus on learning the fighting arts. In Tortal, there's an interesting story here. It used to be that pages became squires without much fuss, but after Alana made it through the whole page training period while pretending to be a boy, the kingdom instituted public tests that everyone could witness, where the pages had to prove they were worthy and ready to be squires. Also in Tortal, there's a choosing element here. A knight had to choose a page to be his squire, and generally all pages are chosen by an existing knight. Finally, we come to the big one, the ritual to go from squire to knight. In our world, this typically occurred at the age of 21, though it could happen earlier for extraordinary acts of valor or during times of war. There was a massive ritual around this, On the evening of the ceremony, the candidate would take a ritual bath to symbolically wash away his sins. He would then dress in white clothes and a red cloak, and he spent the entire night kneeling in prayer before an altar upon which his weapons were laid. The ceremony was usually held during great religious feasts like Christmas or Easter, or at royal weddings. It often involved a mass in the chapel with an audience of knights and ladies. A priest or bishop would bless the candidate's sword and fasten it around his waist, a process known as girding. The candidate took a formal oath to fight against wrongdoers and protect the weak, including widows, orphans, and the poor. And then we come to the final defining ritual, the dubbing. The candidate knelt before his lord or a priest, who would tap or dub him on the shoulders or cheek with a sword. Historically, this was the only blow a knight was required to take without fighting back. And finally, the candidate was presented with golden spurs in the later parts of knighthood, which were attached to his heels as a final mark of his new status. In the legendary case of Ogier the Dane, who was part of the Song of Roland, he was knighted with the sword Cortana, which was inscribed to show its relationship to Roland's magical sword Durendal. Following the ceremony, wealthy households would celebrate with feasting and tournaments that could last for several days. Now, Tamora Pierce used much the same ritual, but she added a magic twist: the chamber of the ordeal. This was a room where knights entered after the night spent in prayer, and they faced in there something which would test their honor. If the chamber found them worthy, they came out and were accepted as knights. If not, well, the chamber had been known to kill. So it was kind of an independent final examiner. How would you do it? What magic from your world would impact on the knight ceremony? Now, before we move on, here's a quick quiz for you. What order is the knight career path in? Okay, let's talk equipment. As I said, one of the skills a page had to learn was looking after horses. And given how important horses are to knights, I think it's only fair that we spend a bit of time talking about them. If the knight is a tank, the horse is half the weapon. We tend to imagine all medieval horses were these massive, slow-moving shires, but that's actually just another myth. In reality, the knight's stable was a pretty specialized toolkit. First you had the destrier. This was the actual war horse, although, strictly speaking, it was technically mostly rode in jousting, but we'll get to that. Anyway, the destrier was chosen for explosive power and aggression. European knights mostly preferred stallions trained to charge without flinching. Now, I'm gonna be real with you. Horses are skittish animals. War horses required a ton of training to get them to ride into battle and not shy away from the lights, the noise, and the danger. Trainers would clash shields, blow trumpets, and even light small fires near the folds to get them used to the chaos of war. Heck, true war horses were trained to be active in combat, biting and kicking and trampling anyone in front of them. The thing about the destrier, though, is that it was quite rare and, as I say, mostly used in jousts, because coursers were the preferred war horse to be used in other areas. And this is for a couple of reasons. First, the destrier was obscenely expensive, and risking it in warfare was putting a lot of money on the table. Kind of like leaving an AWACS plane parked in the open in the age of drones. Anyway, second, coursers were agile, had more endurance, and were more controllable. See, a destrier is a stallion, and those buggers are exhausting to ride. And if they smell a mare, well, good luck with controlling that. Anyway, finally, knights also typically had a palfrey. You didn't ride your expensive high-strung destrier or even your courser to battle. You'd be exhausted before you got there just from controlling the horse, and the horse would be exhausted from carrying you. Instead, you rode your palfrey, a horse with a smooth, ambling gait that wouldn't jar your bones over a 20-mile trek. But the horse is only as good as the connection to the rider, and this is where the war saddle comes in. This was one of the great technological innovations that really made knights absolute monsters on the battlefield. It featured a high front bow and a high rear cantle, effectively locking the knight into place on the back of the horse. When that lance hit an opponent, the force didn't just push against the knight's arm. It pushed against the back of the saddle, which transferred the kinetic energy directly into the horse's 1,000-pound frame. And if you combine that with a rigid steel stirrup, you get immense lateral stability. The stirrup allowed the knight to stand up to deliver a massive downward blow or lean out of the saddle without slipping. And to keep this entire fighting organism moving, we have the nailed horseshoe. Yeah, I'm not kidding. The horseshoe's a technological innovation. Horseshoes are more than just lucky. They're critical to the knight. Before the 11th century, horseshoes were much rarer, and they were basically just tied on rather than nailed. The invention of the nailed shoe allowed horses to gallop over the rocky, wet terrain of northern Europe without risking their hooves. Without that bit of iron, your heavy cavalry is one misstep away from being sidelined with a bruised toe. So, that's all the critical equipment the horse needed. But that was by no means the only equipment for the horse. By the 14th century, the horse was as well protected as the man, and we call horse armor barding. It starts with mail crinets for the neck, and then evolved into plate chevrons for the head and flank cards for the flank. Okay, now let's break physics again. Of course, you can have a horse as the knight's mount, and there's nothing wrong with a good old classic. But this is also where many writers veer into fantasy. You can have mechanical horses in a futuristic setting. Dragons, of course, are a classic. Pegasi could be a great fun twist. Or giant snakes. I'm quite partial to giant snakes. In all cases, what you want to consider is, how does the knight stay on its mount? What is the equivalent of the war saddle and the stirrup? Second, what protects the mount as it is slithering along stones? What's the equivalent of the nailed horseshoe? And third, how about in battle? Does the mount have any kind of armor? This is especially important to consider with flying mounts. Remember, those puppies are going to struggle to fly if you load them down with steel. So what do Pegasi and dragons and the like do for armor? And speaking of armor, when we talk about knightly equipment, we are talking about a multi-century technological arms race between the weaponsmith and the armorsmith. As one side improves, the other side catches up, over and over again, until finally, gunpowder ends the knight's reign. But let's not start at the depressing end. In the 11th century, the gold standard in armor was the hauberk, a knee-length shirt of thousands of interlinked iron rings called mail. Mail was a miracle of its time. It was flexible, it was relatively breathable, and almost impossible to cut with a sword. However, it had a fatal flaw. It was a soft defense. If a mace hit you, the mail didn't break, but your ribs did. This necessitated the acketon or gambeson, a heavy quilted undergarment that acted like a modern ballistic vest to absorb blunt force trauma from those weapons. As the centuries rolled on, swords got bigger and crossbows got stronger, and so armor got more and more plates on top of their mail. By the 13th century, knights began riveting iron plates on the inside of their surcoats, the coat of plates. By the 1400s, this had evolved into the iconic white armor or full plate. Full plate is way more than just a tin can, and nothing illustrates this better than the pig-face bassinet helmet. While this looks bizarre to our modern eyes, that exaggerated conical snout is actually a lifesaver. The geometry was strictly functional. By creating a sharp, protruding point, the armorer ensured that a lance tip or sword thrust would hit a glancing surface. Instead of the full kinetic energy of a charge punching through the steel, the blow would slide off to the side. Furthermore, the snout provided a larger internal cavity, creating a crucial air pocket that allowed the knight to breathe more easily during the frantic oxygen-depleted struggle of a melee, all while keeping the actual breathing holes far enough away from the face to prevent a dagger from finding a lucky entry point. Also, on a side note, the idea that armor was impossible to move in is false. Sure, you're not as agile as a person not wearing armor, but squires did everything, including climbing ladders in armor. They learned to compensate for the weight and the movement restrictions. Obviously, this took training and time. You're not going to put on a suit of armor and be super agile, but that's what training and time were for. Now, to cover the basics, here's what armor is called. Helmet on the head, bevier or gorget on the throat, pauldrons on the shoulder, rebrace, counter, vambrace, gauntlet on the arms, cuirass, placard, folds on the chest, cuisses, pollain, greaves, and sabotons on the legs. And that's the suit. So obviously, this type of armor wasn't made by the bloke down the road. High-end armor was a massive industrial undertaking. You had Harsing Fegers and specialized guilds of plate makers in centers like Milan or Augsburg. A single suit of plate was the medieval equivalent of a Ferrari, custom-fitted, articulated at every joint, and polished to a mirror sheen to prevent rust. On the other side of the arms race is, of course, the weapons. On the charge, the couched lance was the king of the field. By the 12th century, knights started couching their lances, which is to say, tucking the wooden shaft under the armpit. Combined with a lance rest, a metal hook bolted onto the breastplate, this locked the lance to the knight's entire body mass. When that lance point hit, it hit with 1,500 pounds of horse and rider, smashing into the square inch. And that's the way you should smash that like button. Lord, that was terrible. Anyway, hit the like button and hype while you're down there. If the lance shattered, the knight drew his sword, but as plate armor got better, the sword had to change. The classic double-edged arming sword gave way to the estoc, a stiff needle-pointed blade designed specifically to find the gaps in armor, the armpits, the visor, the groin. But if you couldn't find a gap, you could try to break the shell. The mace and the warhammer became essential. A flanged mace didn't need to cut the armor. It needed to transmit enough kinetic energy to cause a concussion or shatter a bone through the steel. Late period knights also favored the poleaxe for dismounted combat. This is a pretty terrifying 4-in-1 weapon that features an axe for chopping, a hammer for crushing, and spikes on both ends for thrusting. And of course, we gotta talk about ranged weapons. Listen, I know, everyone loves a sword, I do myself. But here's the truth. Humans have evolved to throw stuff. We have the best throwing arms in all the world. Our whole motion of throwing is pretty damn unique. And ranged weapons are just a way to throw stuff better. The crossbow was a pretty great way to throw quarrels, which is what you call a crossbow bolt. Using a crankwin, a mechanical geared crank, a commoner with about 2 weeks of training could span a steel bow that could give a knight one heck of a bad time, especially if the knight was wearing cheaper armor. It was so effective and so dishonorable that the Second Lateran Council actually tried to ban the crossbow. It represents the first crack in the knight's monopoly on violence. Of course, the real crack comes with firearms. We were just talking about how expensive it was to train knights. Well, once you had smooth bore guns like the arquebus and whatnot, you could take a peasant, train him in the basics, line him up in a square, and as the knights charge across the battlefield, what do you get? You get dead knights. We like to think that we invent these things, but asymmetric warfare has always been with us. It just means that we have a cheap war unit that can take out an expensive war unit. Not that all knights everywhere keeled over dead once guns appeared on the scene, don't misunderstand me. It took decades, maybe even as much as 100 years, before the institution of knighthood actually faded. But let's leave such depressing conversations behind and talk about spicy world building. That is to say, where fantasy enters the scene. In history, the quality of your steel was limited by the purity of your ore and the heat of your forge. In fantasy, we have mithril, adamant, Valyrian steel, and whatever else you can think of. I made a video about metals in fantasy, which you can check out in the information card. Now, bear in mind, if you introduce a metal that is half the weight and twice as strong as steel, you really change the tactics of the knight. A knight in full plate is agile, but they do have a stamina clock. If mithril armor weighs as much as a silk shirt, your knights upgrade from tanks to Olympic sprinters wearing mesh armor. They don't need horses to cross the battlefield. They can outrun your infantry at that point. The same applies to weapons. If a sword is enchanted to never dull, the specialized guild of sword polishers goes out of business. If a shield can magically absorb kinetic energy, the high-backed saddle becomes less important because the rider isn't being kicked back by the impact. And if you have mages who can throw fireballs, well, you either need magic armor or very costly magic, or you're back to asymmetric warfare and a whole bunch of dead knights. Long story short, a knight's equipment is very worth thinking about. Indeed, it can be way more than just gear. Elizabeth Moon's The Deeds of Paxenorion is perhaps the best example of equipment as character development. Moon, being a former Marine, understands that gear is a burden before it's a benefit. We see Pax start as a recruit in Duke Felon's company. Her equipment is pretty utilitarian. It's a leather jack, a basic sword, and a heavy pack. We feel every mile of the march and every strap that chafes. And as Paxenorion grows, her gear evolves with her status. When she eventually receives her Paladin's gear, we've seen her work for every piece of plate and every sword. Moon also highlights something crucial: maintenance. Pax spends hours cleaning her mail and sharpening her blade. In the Rihanna universe by Judith Tarr, we see a similar focus on the professionalism of the warrior. It's not about the magic of the sword. It's about the fact that the knight knows exactly how to use the weight of that sword to find the gap in the armor. So when you're writing in your world, don't stop at making a magic sword +1 that just hits harder. Create a blade that was forged by a specific guild, that requires a specific oil to keep from rusting, and that weighs enough that the knight's wrist aches after a day of practice. That way, your weapons will feel real. Now, while the epic members of the channel scroll by, let's talk about sword makers. In our world, high-end gear came from massive production centers like Passau, Solingen, and Nuremberg. While it's What's really cool is that they actually did mark their blades. Yes, swordmaker marks were absolutely real. If you saw the running wolf stamp of a Passau blade, you knew you were holding the finest steel in Europe, a mark so prestigious it's been found on swords from London to Gdansk. Even the Grand Masters of the Teutonic Order wouldn't settle for local knockoffs. Records show them paying massive sums, over 12 marks, just to have their male hauberks imported from the master workshops of Nuremberg. We even have some of the names of the smiths that have survived in the ledgers through the years, like Master Jacob the armourer or Peter Bogener the crossbow maker, and through them we see a world of extreme specialization. A knight didn't just go to a smith, he dealt with a swartverger to polish and sharpen his blade, a harsingveger to assemble his plate, and kisten makers and settlers, carpenters and saddlers to build his shield. It was a fragmented assembly line of experts. This level of guild-driven perfection is exactly what we're reaching for in fantasy when we talk about Valerian steel or the smiths of Nogrod. In your own world building, it's worth thinking about such master craftsmen's places. It's historical, it's fun, and it's even more valid in the case of magical items. Because at the end of the day, a knight is only as good as the guy who spent 10 hours polishing his visor. Next time, we'll talk about what a knight actually does, from questing to politics to war. So make sure you're subscribed for that. If you made it this far, leave me a sword in the comments. And if you want to see more from me, check out my video on how to create an honor code, and I will see you soon for another one.